Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story, The Lantern That Burned Cold. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones, no matter how many layers you wore. The wind whispered through the empty streets of St. Aubrey, carrying with it the scent of the sea and something else, something metallic, like rusted iron. Nate pulled his scarf tight around his neck as he stood outside the weathered cabin on the edge of the cliffs. The place didn't look like much, but it was all he could afford. He was here for the winter, tasked with cataloging the effects of the late Professor Emerick Thorne, a once prominent scholar whose name had been all but erased from academic circles after his mysterious death 3 decades ago. Nate shoved the key into the rusty lock, forcing the stubborn door open with a groan. Inside, the cabin was sparse, a single room with a sagging bed, a small table, and a fireplace that looked as though it hadn't seen a flame in years. Against the far wall was the reason for his trip, a battered trunk, its corners reinforced with tarnished brass. He set his bat down and moved toward the trunk, his breath visible in the frigid air. The latch was stiff, but it gave way under his hands. Inside was a collection of notebooks, old photographs, and a peculiar object wrapped in faded burlap. Carefully, he pulled the bundle out, unwrapping it to reveal an ornate lantern. It was unlike anything he had seen before. The metal was blackened, as though it had been through a fire, but the intricate carvings etched into its surface were untouched by time or flame. The glass panes were tinged with an unnatural frost, even in the warmth of his hands. At the base of the lantern was a simple engraving to light the way through the coldest dark. Nate set the lantern on the table, his curiosity piqued. He rifled through the notebooks, hoping to find some explanation for its significance. The professor's handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but one entry caught his attention. The lantern is not merely an object, it is a vessel. It burns cold to ward off the warmth of what follows. One must not light it unless there is no other choice. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and the temperature seemed to plummet. Nate glanced at the fireplace, deciding it was time to get a fire going. He had noticed a small stack of wood outside. As he opened the door, he frowned. In the distance, along the path leading to the cliffs, he saw a figure. It was barely visible against the gray backdrop of the ocean, but something about its stillness unnerved him. The figure did not move, nor did it appear to have any features he could make out. It was just standing there. He stepped back inside, bolting the door. His heart pounded as he turned to face the lantern. The professor's words echoed in his mind. One must not light it unless there is no other choice. The wind howled again, and from outside came the faint sound like someone whispering his name. The whispering grew louder as the wind battered the cabin, a low murmur like 1,000 voices speaking just beneath the edge of hearing. Nate pressed his back against the door, his breath coming in short gasps. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. "It's just the wind." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The way the sound curled through the air, calling his name, was too deliberate, too purposeful. He glanced toward the lantern, its frosted panes glinting in the dim light. He needed to distract himself. The trunk, the professor's notes, anything but the growing sense of unease clawing at his chest. Nate pulled a notebook from the trunk and flipped through its brittle pages. Most of it was indecipherable dense equations, sketches of strange symbols, and fragments of text in languages he didn't recognize. But one passage stood out, scrawled in hurried, uneven letters. "When it begins, do not look, do not listen. The lantern must remain unlit unless the dark has taken root. Trust the cold, it is the only shield you have." The wind outside ceased suddenly, plunging the cabin into an eerie silence. Nate frowned, every hair on his body standing on end. The silence was worse than the whispers. It felt watchful. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite, as though someone was testing to see if he was home. Nate's blood ran cold. He hadn't seen another soul since he arrived in St. Aubrey. He crept to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. The figure was closer now, standing at the edge of the path leading to the cabin. It still didn't move, but he could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. The knock came again, louder this time. Nate backed away from the window, his eyes darting to the lantern. It seemed to pulse faintly, as though reacting to the unseen presence outside. His mind raced. Should he light it? The professor's warnings were clear, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the lantern was somehow meant for this moment. The third knock was a deafening boom, rattling the cabin to its foundation. The door buckled under the force, and a sharp crack split the air as the wood began to splinter. Nate grabbed the lantern with trembling hands, his fingers brushing against the strange carvings. They were cold, so cold they burned. A voice came from the other side of the door, low and gravelly, yet strangely familiar. "Nate, open the door. It's freezing out here." It was his brother's voice, the voice of a man who had been dead for 5 years. "No," Nate whispered, shaking his head. "You're not real." The voice laughed, a hollow, humorless sound that sent shivers down his spine. "I'm as real as you need me to be. Let me in, little brother." The lantern grew colder in his hands, almost unbearably so. Nate's breath hitched as he fumbled for the flint and steel he had seen in the trunk. He didn't know what would happen if he lit the lantern, but he was out of options. The door shattered, and the figure stepped inside. His face was a swirling void, its shape barely holding together, as though it were made of shadows and smoke. Nate struck the flint, the spark catching the wick. The lantern flared to life with an icy blue flame that filled the room with a searing cold. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying candle. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, as though 100 voices were screaming in unison. Nate clutched the lantern, its frost-beaten surface biting into his palms. The figure writhed, its shadowy form disintegrating under the cold light. But as it dissolved, it spoke one final word, its voice twisting into something almost human. "Run." The flame flickered, and for a moment, Nate thought it would go out, but the light held steady, casting its eerie glow across the cabin. The figure was gone, but the air was heavy with its presence, as though it had merely retreated into the shadows. Nate slumped to the floor, the lantern still clutched in his hands. He didn't know what he had unleashed, but one thing was clear: the professor's warnings were not to be taken lightly. From the trunk, the notebook seemed to hum faintly, as though waiting for him to uncover their secrets. And outside, on the path to the cliffs, more figures began to gather. The lantern's flame burned cold, but it was far from enough to keep the dark at bay. Nate didn't sleep that night. He Saturday hunched by the dying fireplace, the lantern still glowing with its cold, unearthly flame. It illuminated the cabin in flickering shadows, casting strange shapes against the walls. Outside, the figures lingered silent, unmoving, yet undeniably watching. Their presence pressed on him like a weight, a suffocating reminder that he was far from alone. He tried to focus on the professor's notes, desperate for answers. The journals were filled with fragments of information, cryptic warnings, arcane symbols, and drawings of the lantern in various states of disrepair. One page caught his eye, marked with a smear of dried ink that looked almost like blood. "The lantern binds and wards, but its light draws them near. You cannot banish them forever, only hold them at bay. Use it sparingly, lest you invite their hunger. To stop them, you must sever the tether." "Tether," Nate murmured, flipping through more pages. The professor seemed maddeningly vague, as though he had been too terrified to write anything concrete. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it a sound that turned Nate's stomach a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to look out the window. The figures were closer now, no longer standing at the edge of the path. They had moved just beyond the cabin's perimeter. There were more of them, two down scenes of shapes shrouded in shadow, their outlines flickering as though they were made of smoke. Nate's breathing quickened as he looked back at the lantern. The professor's notes repeated in his head. The light draws them near. Was it the lantern that had attracted them in the first place? Or were they always coming, and the lantern was the only thing keeping them from crossing the threshold? The groaning grew louder, joined by whispers that seemed to echo from all directions. Nate scrambled for the journals, desperate for something, anything that could help. His fingers landed on a folded sheet tucked between the pages of one notebook. It was a map, rough and hand-drawn, with markings indicating the cliffs, the cabin, and a location further inland labeled Sanctuary. Underneath the map was a single line of text: "The tether lies within. Do not delay." A loud thud jolted Nate out of his thoughts. The figures were pressing against the windows now, their forms shifting and writhing like oil on water. One of them raised an amorphous limb and struck the glass again. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. Nate didn't wait to see what would happen next. Grabbing the lantern, he shoved the journals into his bag and threw it over his shoulder. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the fireplace poker leaning against the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed it before unbolting the door. The cold hit him like a wall, and the whispers surged in intensity. The figures turned toward him in unison, their featureless faces locking onto the lantern in his hands. For a moment, they didn't move. Then, they began to follow. Nate ran. The path to the cliffs was treacherous, slick with ice and uneven from years of neglect. The lantern's cold light barely illuminated the way, but it was enough to see the shapes closing in behind him. They didn't run, they glided, their movements unnatural and jerky, like puppets on invisible strings. The wind howled, carrying with it fragments of speech that made Nate's skin crawl. "Nate, don't run, come back." The voices were distorted, blending into each other in a cacophony of despair. He didn't look back. His breath came in sharp, icy gasps as he veered off the path, following the map's rough directions toward the inland marker. The terrain grew more difficult, the frowning ground giving way to dense underbrush and jagged rocks. The lantern's flame flickered, and for a horrifying moment, it seemed like it might go out. The figures surged closer, their whispers now deafening. One of them reached for him, its shadowy appendage brushing against his arm. The cold was unbearable, a searing pain that shot through his entire body. Nate swung the fireplace poker wildly, the metal passing through the figure as though it weren't there, but the motion was enough to disrupt its form, and it recoiled, momentarily retreating into the darkness. The lantern flared brighter, its icy light forcing the others to halt. Nate took the chance to press forward, stumbling into a clearing. At the center stood a crumbling stone structure, half buried in snow and ivy. It looked like an ancient shrine, its surface etched with the same symbols he had seen in the professor's journals. The whispers grew louder as he approached, the figures circling the edges of the clearing but refusing to step closer. The lantern pulsed in his hands, the frost on its glass panes spreading outward like veins. In the center of the shrine was an altar, and upon it lay a stone tablet engraved with more of the strange runes. Nate set the lantern down, its light bathing the shrine in an eerie glow. The runes seemed to respond, their edges beginning to shimmer faintly. One line of text stood out among the others, carved deeper than the rest. "The tether binds the light to the dark. To sever it, one must sacrifice what the code has claimed." Nate stared at the words, their meaning gnawing at the edges of his mind. The professor's warning echoed again. The lantern is not merely an object. It is a vessel. The groaning returned, louder and more menacing. The figures were closing in, their hesitation giving way to hunger. Nate gripped the poker in one hand and the lantern in the other. He didn't know what the tether was, but he had a sinking feeling it wasn't just a metaphor. The lantern burned brighter, its cold flame crackling like ice. The dark was closing in, and time was running out. Nate's hands trembled as he held the lantern, its cold flame dancing violently within its frosted panes. The clearing buzzed with an oppressive energy, the air heavy with the whispers of the shadows that surrounded him. The figures were no longer lingering at the edge, they were advancing, inch by inch, their forms undulating like smoke given shape. The words on the altar burned in his mind. "The tether binds the light to the dark. To sever it, one must sacrifice what the code has claimed." "What does that even mean?" Nate whispered, his voice lost in the cacophony of the whispers. His breath came out in clouds, the frigid air biting at his lungs. He glanced around, hoping for some sort of revelation. The lantern pulsed in his hands, almost as if it was alive, urging him toward the altar. Its cold light flared with each step he took, the figures recoiling slightly but never stopping. When he reached the altar, he placed the lantern at its center. The shadows halted, their forms rippling as if in agitation. The whispers grew more intense, individual voices breaking through the din. "Don't do it. It will destroy you. We are not your enemy." Nate shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "Shut up," he screamed, slamming his hand onto the altar. His voice echoed through the clearing, momentarily silencing the whispers. Then, one voice rose above the rest, calm and clear, resonating deep within his mind. "You know what it means. The code claimed you the moment you lit the lantern. You are the tether." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He thought back to the professor's notes, the cryptic warnings about the lantern being a vessel and the danger of lighting it. The flame didn't just protect him, it bound him to whatever dark force the lantern held at bay. The figures seemed to sense his hesitation. They surged forward, their shadowy forms blending into one mass that loomed at the edge of the altar's light. Nate's heart pounded as he gripped the edge of the stone. He didn't want to die, but if he didn't sever the tether, the lantern's light would fail, and the shadows would consume everything. The cold from the lantern seeped deeper into his skin, spreading through his veins like ice. He glanced at his hands and saw frost creeping across his fingertips, the tips of his nails already blackened. The lantern was taking him piece by piece. With a shaky breath, Nate raised the fireplace poker and swung it against the lantern. The metal struck with a deafening crack, but the lantern didn't break. Instead, the flame flared violently, the cold intensifying until it felt as though his skin would shatter like glass. "Sacrifice what the code has claimed." Nate's eyes widened, He understood now. It wasn't the lantern that needed to be destroyed, it was him. He turned the poker in his hands, his breath hitching as he positioned the sharp end against his chest. The whispers rose in a deafening chorus, some pleading, others laughing, but all of them watching. The shadows surged forward, desperate now, clawing at the edges of the light. Nate clenched his teeth, his vision blurring with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to no one and everyone, and, with all the strength he could muster, he plunged the poker into his chest. The pain was immediate and all-consuming, but it wasn't the searing agony he expected. Instead, it was cold and unbearable, all-encompassing cold that spread outward from the wound, freezing everything in its path. The lantern's flame flared one final time, its light blinding and pure, before extinguishing in an explosion of icy shards. The shadows let out a collective scream, their forms disintegrating as the cold consumed them. The clearing was filled with a deafening roar as the dark was obliterated, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Nick collapsed to the ground, his vision fading. The frost on his hands spread up his arms, encasing him in a layer of ice. He felt the cold seep into his heart, and then, nothing. When the villagers of St. Aubrey found the shrine days later, they discovered Nate's frown-seamed body curled at the altar, his hands clutching the shattered remains of a lantern. The clearing was quiet now, the oppressive energy that once lingered there gone. In the months that followed, strange stories began to circulate. Travelers claimed to see a faint blue light flickering along the cliffs on stormy nights, and some said they heard whispers carried on the wind. The lantern was gone, its pieces lost to time, but the cold it left behind never truly faded, and neither did the shadows. They were waiting, patient and hungry, for the day the light would burn cold once more. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching.